From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Rosie Wright.
Okay, thank you very much. This is big stuff.
Last week, when President Trump addressed the nation after the US attack on Venezuela, assistant editor for The Times US, David Charter, he had his eye on one particular man, and it wasn't Trump.
Several of his top aides file out behind him for the duration of the press conference. And a little later, when it comes to questions, he's asked, so who exactly is going to be running the country that you've just decapitated?
What's the group you mentioned that would run Venezuela?
Well, it's largely going to be, for a period of time, the people that are standing right behind me.
And Trump just turns around and gestures behind him and says, well, the people behind me, I guess, are going to be running it for now. And that includes Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, the War Secretary, but also on the end of the line is this figure who has been a bit of a shadowy figure for the general population, but not in Trump world, is extremely well known, and that's Stephen Miller, who has come up through the ranks as a speechwriter for Trump in his first term, very quickly involved in all sorts of domestic policy, and now it seems branching out into foreign policy as well.
You invaded the country, went into the country, and we seized the leader of Venezuela.
Damn straight we did.
One thing you can say about Stephen Miller, he doesn't mince his words.
And I'm
Because
saying,
we're not going to let.
so is the U.S. going to have new elections?
Jake, is that we're not going to let Tin Pot communist dictators send rapists into our country, send drugs into our country, send weapons into our country.
Okay.
And we're not going to let a country fall into the hands of our adversaries.
But who is this guy, this outspoken firebrand who seems to be actually the one pulling the strings in the Trump administration? To understand the sort of aggressive plan that Trump has to reshape America and, well, the world over, we need to understand the man behind the mission.
We stand here today at a crossroads in the history of this nation, in the history of our civilization. This is a choice between betrayal and renewal, between self-destruction and salvation, between the failure of America or the triumph of America.
The story today. Who is Stephen Miller, the man behind Trump's Greenland grab? So David, Stephen Miller has been part of Trump's circle kind of for as long as Trump has had a circle, the first administration, the gap in between. And then now he's such a sort of instrumental part of Trump's leadership now. Today, we're devoting an entire episode to him because I think he's taken centre stage in the last week and many of us aren't familiar. So can you just describe him for us?
Yes, Stephen Miller is a 40-year-old Californian. He's always been an advocate of very aggressive right-wing politics, even though he was brought up in quite a liberal democratic environment in Santa Monica.
The Democrat Party does not fight for, care about, or represent American citizens. It is an entity devoted exclusively to the defense of hardened criminals, gangbangers, and illegal alien killers and terrorists.
We've seen time and time again that Stephen Miller has taken strong contrarian opinions against the orthodoxy, not just on the left, but on the right. And when he's got pushback and when he's been criticised and shunned, he seems to relish that moment and enjoy it tremendously.
I mean, to prove the point, I was booked to talk about the very issues I'm just describing, and you're not even asking about them because they're not interesting facts to you.
That's not true. I have plenty of questions on immigration. You've attempted to filibuster by talking about your flights with the president. I want to ask you a question because
don't be condescending, Jake.
Stephen,
Jake,
the president and the White House.
The reason why I want to talk about...
He's also incredibly passionate about his beliefs when given the chance behind the microphone, which Trump is doing increasingly. bringing him out in the Oval Office now to join the conversation.
President Trump's initiative here in Washington, D.C., it's important to understand, is the most successful anti-crime initiative in American history. I mean, just think about it for a second. In 30 days, President Trump put together a team that saw the largest ever violent crime reduction in any city.
So, in reality, his official title doesn't quite convey actually the scope of his power and his influence. What is his official title?
So in the second term of Trump's presidency, Stephen Miller is titled Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, and there are several Deputy Chiefs of Staff, but that really doesn't quite capture the extraordinary influence this man has over the president and over policy in America today. He really ranges far beyond the speech writing and immigration policy that he was responsible for in the first term, and seems to have a finger in just about every pie of Trump's most notable policies. This is just a reflection of just how much Trump trusts and values having Stephen Miller at his side. And it all stems from the start, the speech writing, when he really credits Miller with helping him find his voice. And this may sound strange to listeners who think, well, Trump has got a unique voice, he's his own man. But when you look back at the speeches that Miller wrote, including Trump's address to the Republican convention in 2016 and the inaugural address in 2017, which talked of American carnage, you see various phrases inserted by Miller, such as radical Islam keeps popping up. And it's really Miller who's toughened up Trump's rhetoric on migrants and the border.
Miller's been undeniably totally loyal to President Trump. Do you think that's had a part to play throughout the first administration, stuck with him in that intervening period where, lots of people had sort of lost faith in Donald Trump? Miller was right alongside him.
Trump really values dog-like loyalty, and he really rewards it and allows those who show it to have his ear and guide policy.
I think it would be good to look at some of that policy. And to understand it, maybe we need to understand his worldview, this sort of Trump loyalist since the beginning. He now has incredible influence in the administration. So what underpins all of that? What does he care about?
I think to understand Stephen Miller, you've got to understand the almost apocalyptic way that he feels there's a battle pitting the forces of wickedness and evil against America's noble and virtuous people. He famously wrote in his high school yearbook a quote attributed to President Theodore Roosevelt, which is that there can be no 50-50 Americanism in this country. There's only room here for 100% Americanism, only for those who are Americans and nothing else. And we've seen that reflected in Stephen Miller's views from his teenage years.
That's quite a dramatic statement, isn't it? To say, total Americanism. David, it seems that worldview was kind of baked in very early. I mean, you mentioned his early years, but should we go all the way back to the beginning? Where's Miller from? What kind of helped sow the seeds of the views he had?
So Miller is born in 1985 in Santa Monica in California to a family from Ashkenazi Jewish descent whose great-grandparents escaped the Holocaust and came to America. After attending a Hebrew school as a youngster, he went to the Santa Monica High School, where he quickly became known among fellow students for being a contrarian.
Hi, I'm Stephen Miller.
He's remembered from one incident where he was running for the student council, where he was booed off stage during his campaign speech.
That no one else in their right mind would say or do. Am I the only one who is sick and tired of being told to pick up my trash? And we have plenty of janitors who are paid.
This just speaks to a number of incidents that are actually well recorded from his teenage years, including extraordinary film of him apparently on a school bus, age 17, where he's discussing the Iraq War.
Iraqi civilians. I think that as many of them should survive as possible, because the goal of any military conflict is to kill as few people as possible. But as for Saddam Hussein and his henchmen, I think the ideal solution would be to cut off their fingers.
And enjoying winding up his fellow students by talking about torture as a celebration of life and human dignity.
I don't think it's necessary to kill them entirely. We're not a barbaric people. We respect life. Therefore, torture is the way to go. Because torture people can live. Torture is a celebration of life and human dignity.
I mean, his views are really sort of flying in the face of where he's growing up in California. You know, he it seems from what you're saying that it was from very early on that he felt like, I'm going to take a different path and do that quite loudly.
Yes, we know that his parents were originally registered as Democrats, thought to be Kennedy Democrats, so on the conservative end, but nevertheless, it's probably quite telling that when he left for college, according to Los Angeles County records, his parents switched their registration to Republican from Democrat.
So do you think he was sort of persuasive, even at that very early stage in his life?
I do think we can infer from that he's always been an incredibly persuasive character. And that's the kind of drive and commitment and self-belief that's propelled him to this national role he's got today.
So what happens after high school? We've seen he's not sort of prepared to take centre stage and, you know, make a bit of a song and dance about that. What does he do next?
So Miller heads to Duke University, which is across the country in North Carolina. Another fairly liberal environment, actually. But here is where a critical moment of his life takes place that really begins to launch him into national politics. There was a famous incident that was on the news in America for months and months, where a black woman who was an exotic dancer accused 3 white male lacrosse players of rape. And the student body was overwhelmingly, at the time, appearing to side with the supposed victim in this case.
I want to go to Stephen Miller with the Duke Conservative Union. Stephen Miller, what's your response to the indictments handed down and the arrests?
But not Miller.
Well, I think I speak for many students when I say that we're very, very concerned that 2 innocent people may have possibly just had their lives ruined.
Lord!
You're saying it's not possible or innocent. That's not even in the realm of possibility.
It's not possible, but a grand jury has heard evidence and deemed this fit to go to a trial.
Right, and we're saying that
without ever hearing what the victim has to say, you're saying the grand jury is wrong.
I'm not saying I'm convinced at all.
The victim is lying, and your first problem is 2 innocent people.
I didn't say that. I said we're concerned that it's possible that 2 innocent people may have had their lives ruined, because this case does have many irregularities and many inconsistencies.
Do you have a sister?
Yes, I do, but I would appreciate it.
I assume you've got a mother.
And in the long run, he was vindicated. It did take quite a long time, but it eventually emerged that the rape allegations had been completely made up and all the charges were dropped. And this was a formative moment that confirmed for Miller that the knee-jerk reactions of liberals were to be opposed in every way, because it fitted in with his worldview that white America was under existential attack from wokeism and liberalism.
And those ideas that you talk about are then evidenced in the policies that he pursues later on in his work alongside Donald Trump. But I guess that case, to what extent, David, did that just catapult him going on national TV, saying those at the time quite controversial things to elevate his profile and then ultimately his career?
Yes, Miller has begun to make the contacts that will get him established in Washington, D.C. after university, not only by going on cable TV and other right-wing networks, but by coming to the attention of more senior figures in the national political world who would give him a leg up and get him established in Congress as an advisor. Miller expressed his approach during the Lacrosse incident in an article for the university newspaper, when he wrote that, with the players at last nearing release from criminal charges, we're reminded that justice is not always swift. Instead, it's often a crawl, gently creeping forward, which, if enough momentum builds, can turn into an avalanche. Unified, we can marshal this momentum. And I think it's a very informative quote to understand why he's prepared to stick out on his own for unpopular opinions, because he's so firmly of the belief he's right and that the rest of the world will catch up with him. And that's what the Lacrosse incident taught him.
David, you've been telling us about Stephen Miller, this sort of incredibly influential figure inside the Trump administration, and his anti-liberal worldview, how that was cemented. He stepped into the national spotlight with those appearances on Fox News. Tell us what he does next.
So after university, Miller is helped into his first job in Washington by a friend with great contacts who links him up with a congresswoman called Michelle Bachmann, who may not be so well known to listeners right now, but who was a very influential Republican representative because she helped to found the Tea Party movement that was really an earthquake in Republicanism back at the time. These were the anti-establishment fiscal conservatives who completely shook up the party. And Miller saw just how these disruptors, by sticking to their guns, could take policy in a dramatic new direction.
So when does his work first kind of catch the eye of Donald Trump, who presumably at that point is not actually a politician yet?
Yes, this is all before Trump is launching his campaign in 2015. The year before, Miller, who by now has gained a close friendship and alliance with Steve Bannon, another influential figure in the rise of Donald Trump, of course. Together, Miller and Bannon, they ran a campaign for a complete outsider against one of the top establishment Republicans in the House, Eric Cantor, who was actually the leader of the Republicans in the House at the time, based on their anti-immigration message.
Doug, good morning to you. What happened to Cantor?
Well, it's just an absolutely stunning defeat for the second most powerful Republican in the House of Representatives.
They were able to turf Cantor out of the House in a really stunning victory for, again, a complete disruption from the anti-immigrant right.
This solidly conservative district has been inspired in recent days by the immigration issue, especially given this influx of young Central Americans across border states, which is overwhelming the infrastructure in those border states.
And this was welcomed by Donald Trump at the time, who possibly was thinking about his run, saying that he thought Cantor didn't win because he was too soft on immigration. And Miller wrote to friends at the time, "Trump gets it. I wish he'd run for president."
And then look at what happens. So very early on, Stephen Miller was happy to sort of align himself with Donald Trump at that point, maybe considering running. He must have been pretty thrilled then when Donald Trump said publicly, I'm going for this.
Stephen Miller signed up immediately as soon as Donald Trump came down the escalator famously at Trump Tower and announced his campaign. This is what Miller had been waiting for, a disruptive, anti-illegal immigrant speaking candidate who was going to shake up politics. Miller saw it immediately and jumped in And thanks to Bannon, he got a place on the Trump campaign.
Every single person in this room is going to have to stay active and stay engaged every day for the next 8 years. Because as all of you know, there are a lot of people in this country and around the world who've been getting rich off the rigged system for a very long time.
So tell us what happens next, because he gets catapulted to a position of responsibility where he is then responsible for some really instrumental and actually pretty controversial policies.
Yes, that's right. Miller, who was policy director of the Trump's transition, then gets a role in the White House as a senior advisor on policy. And this is where he begins his virtual takeover of the domestic agenda for Trump. And of course, those executive orders at the start of Trump's first term, which stunned and shocked America and the world, the attempt to ban all travel from various Muslim countries, which was strongly contested in the courts, and perhaps even more notoriously, the policy of family separation at the border, where migrant children would be placed in a different custody than their parents or guardians, which became a subject of huge controversy in the first term, but was, of course, in line with Stephen Miller's desire to cut illegal migration to zero.
They did end up having to row back on some of those policies, didn't they?
Well, the policy did continue for about 18 months at the border, and more than 1,000 families were separated thanks to Stephen Miller's approach.
New polls show a majority do not support President Trump on this issue. The administration is refusing to back down from this tough stance.
Catholic bishops and a former Republican First Lady are joining the growing outcry over the detention of migrant children.
But in the end, opposition, both from immigration groups and the courts, became overwhelming, and the policy was abandoned after a couple of years in office.
And tell us what changed, because obviously they had those years governing. Then Joe Biden, of course, is elected US president. A lot of those policies are completely reversed. Now in Trump's second term, Stephen Miller's position actually seems to be far larger than it was before. How's his influence changed?
So Miller served in the first term as an advisor. His role has grown considerably, I would say, in the second term. Now he's not only got his title as a deputy chief of staff, but he is in and out of the Oval Office constantly. He has an office pretty close by, and he has the president's ear. And we've seen that during the first year of this second term, where he's become much more prominent in Oval Office presentations, for example, where, in fact, on one quite notable occasion back in October, Trump was signing an executive order to send troops into Memphis, and alongside him was Stephen Miller.
Was right back in the audience, right there. I'd love to have him.
But even Trump seemed a little nervous about the kind of extreme things that often come out of Miller's mouth.
I'd love to have him come up and explain his true feelings, but maybe not his truest feelings. That might be going a little bit too far. But Stephen, thank you for doing it.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it is remarkable, even for Donald Trump to talk about someone with a caveat. And you do kind of wonder who really is pulling the strings here if the US president's prepared to publicly admit that. One area where Miller's been so deeply involved is immigration policy, particularly how what we know as ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, operates. Those ICE raids have been really thrust into the spotlight this week after the tragic killing of a woman in Minneapolis. Tell us more about sort of how controversial that's been.
Yes, well, it's Miller who oversees the team writing executive orders on the crackdown on illegal migrants. It's Miller who wants to see through and intensify what they tried to do in the first term. It's Miller, for example, who's come up with policies like using the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, an almost forgotten piece of legislation, to carry out deportations of illegal migrants by shoving habeas corpus to one side. I mean, that's the right of people to have their day in court. Miller just wants to put them on planes and ship them out to third countries as soon as possible. And so what we've seen consistently, I think, is how he pushes the envelope for Trump. Trump likes it because he's a bundle of energy and ideas. But it is right to ask the question, who is driving policy in America?
And who do you think is, David? When you're kind of doing your job, speaking to sources and contacts, what do people say about this quite extreme influence it seems to be that Stephen Miller has?
Oh, there's no doubt that when the history of the Trump administration is written, a lot more prominence will be given to Miller than perhaps he's had up to date. The Trump team were incredibly well prepared to hit the ground running when they came into office, and an overwhelming number of executive orders, the most since actually FDR in wartime America in 1942. That was the last year where there were more executive orders issued by Trump, and he's not writing them. It's mainly Stephen Miller and his team who are behind this, what's been called an extraordinary power grab by Trump to basically ignore Congress and run the country himself. I think Stephen Miller has mastered the art of navigating Trump with a combination of really quite humble flattery. He always, whenever he speaks, he will always give 100% credit to Trump for his leadership, whilst at the same time being able to convey to Trump and convince him of ever more extreme and hair-raising policies, which Trump likes. Trump does not want to appear to his voters to have become mainstream or comfortable in his role. He consistently wants to be surprising America with new and audacious policies, and that's what we've seen in the second term.
What was undeniably audacious was the action from the Trump administration in Venezuela. And now the questions about Greenland, of which Miller's been very happy to speak in very strong terms, live on television, on CNN.
What is their basis of having Greenland as a colony of Denmark? The United States is the power of NATO. For the United States to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States. And so that's a conversation that we're going to have as a country. That's a process.
How does Greenland fit into all of this, and particularly Miller's role in it?
Well, so when we saw Stephen Miller lining up behind Donald Trump with the small group of people he said were running Venezuela, that was just an indication of how he's expanded his role from domestic policy to foreign policy. What we've seen right through from his teenage years, isn't it? That Stephen Miller seems to enjoy nothing more than putting out there and defending the most extreme case for what he believes a superpower like America should be doing.
We've got 3 more years of this administration. So what do you think he's going to do with that power? What's his plan for America?
Stephen Miller's plan is pretty clear from everything we've seen throughout his career, which is to use his power to push for a much more nationalistic view of American domestic and foreign policy. Everything is in the service of Donald Trump and MAGA and America first. Stephen Miller's going to just use his position to push Donald Trump down the nationalist, America first, anti-immigrant route that he has embodied throughout his whole career.
And it sounds as though you think he's got the influence to try and do that.
Well, he's shown it, hasn't he, over and again. Stephen Miller knows that this is his moment. He's got himself into a very senior position as the key domestic and increasingly foreign policy advisor of the President of the United States, the most powerful political leader in the world. And he's going to use it.
That was David Charter, an assistant editor for The Times based in Washington, D.C. You can find all of his reporting, including an in-depth explainer on what exactly ICE is, at thetimes.com with a subscription. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel. The executive producer was Tim Walklate, and the sound design and the theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. If you have thoughts on what you just heard, send us an email at thestory@thetimes.com. Or if you're listening on Spotify, leave us a comment. We review those every week and try to publish as many as we can. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.